Hey, and welcome to this digestive system overview. This is just going to be a kind of brief synopsis of what happens throughout our digestive system. And for those of you who know me, you may be aware that I'm a holistic skin therapist, I'm a naturopath, I'm an educator. I have many other certifications in things like yoga and Reiki and mindfulness and NLP and Qigong. I'm really fascinated with the way our body functions and the energy behind that and the psychological aspects behind that. And I love interlinking all of these things when I provide education. But part of the reason, after being a skin therapist for over 25 years now, I'm so fascinated with what happens within our gut is because of the things that we can see in the skin when things aren't working so well. We are obviously the building blocks of everything we eat, yet we're also the building blocks of everything that our digestive system can actually digest and absorb and utilize. So it's a whole lot more complex than actually what you're sitting down to eat every single day. And the other amazing thing is that both the skin and the gut are so remarkably similar in structure. They're both really densely vascularized, they're richly innervated, they've got really crucial immune and neuroendocrine roles. They're just so uniquely related in purpose and in function. And when you have a greater depth of understanding of the digestive system, it can really help you understand a lot more about what could be happening within your skin as your largest organ. But saying that, each single one of our organ systems is active and it's dynamic. Um, there's cells that are continually growing, specializing, functioning, dying, regenerating. Every single organ system and tissue is affected by what occurs in our digestive system. And any imbalance or dysfunction in one will cascade because there is this synergy of cell communication. And if there's also a nutrient deficit on top of that, because of the way our digestive system is functioning, it can create a progressive downward spiral, not just for the one organ system involved, but for any or all of these. And I guess this is where chronic disease stems from. 1 in 8 Australians have a chronic disease. You don't just catch a chronic disease, it is a progressive calibration to that state of dis-ease or disharmony within the body. And I'm fascinated with this on many different levels. Obviously, this picture is showing the 11 very well known, scientifically quantified organ systems of our body. Yet I also include our microbiomes as another body system, because without it, we cannot survive. I also include our energy system as being imperative to this. Our energy and what I call our emotional state is so interlinked with the functioning of all our different organ systems, particularly our digestive tract. And if you pare back an organ system and think about what it's made of, an organ system is made of tissues. Tissues are made of collections of cells. Cells are made up of molecules. And what is it that makes up these molecules? Well, it is atoms. Oh, it is DNA. And what is it that makes up this DNA? Well, they are actually nucleotide bases, they're amino acids. But what makes up DNA, like the smallest component to the cell? That's what most people normally think about DNA as being. Yet it's actually atoms that make up these components. And atoms actually are coming in even smaller particles called subatomic particles called quarks and gluons. And there's all these other aspects to do with atoms. But why I'm bringing this to your attention is because atoms are mainly energy. They've got these protons and neutrons, this nucleus it's orbited by their electrons. The electrons are kind of moving and dancing and weaving around. There's this huge amount of vast spaciousness actually within atoms. So atoms are 99.999% space, but they're also huge amounts of energy moving in and around them. And our energetic state will really change the energy state of these atoms. And then the atoms are making up elements which make up molecules, and then you get the whole progression back into your organ system. And so it's working together, our energy, our atoms, our cells, our tissues, and our organ systems, plus all our various microbiomes. With all of our organs have their own particular unique microbiomes going on. They all need to assist each other so that we can live our best and healthiest lives. And I'm just so passionate about sharing how the interlinking and the interconnectedness between what some people can think is quite separate systems is just so important to really understand the big picture of a person, because together they all need to maintain our unique personal homeostasis to supply our body with the essential energy and biological materials that we need to function, as well as facilitating the elimination of waste. But I'm not particularly just interested in just functioning, just surviving. I'm really interested in people thriving. And that's where I get my passion from. And my mission is to change the way people think, live, and treat. So even though this is more of a linear presentation, I'm not going to weave in all the myriad of different aspects when I do my longer presentations and seminars, but I hope to give you a more complete understanding in a pretty brief overview. This is quite a complex system that we're just about to have a look at. So let us begin. Welcome to our beautiful gastrointestinal tract. You can see in this picture, so we've the very first point of entry is our mouth. And to help what happens in our mouth, we've got our salivary glands, they're accessory organs or glands. And then we need to use our pharynx and then our esophagus as we swallow food. And then the food starts its passage. It moves from voluntary control in our mouth and our pharynx and the top third of our esophagus into involuntary control. So from once we swallow and it moves into the second third of our esophagus, we have no more conscious control over what is actually happening to our food processes. One of our nervous systems, the autonomic nervous system, kicks into gear at this point. And that's really important. And it's something that I do spend a lot more time unpacking again in other seminars and lectures, but it's just a really important point that you understand from there. And so anyway, the food moves through our esophagus and it hits our stomach. And it stays in our stomach for a little while, and then it starts its passage into the small intestine. I'll move my cursor. I'm hoping you guys can see my cursor. So it moves from the stomach into the small intestine. And in the small intestine, there's some signaling that gets the gallbladder to release the bile that's made in our liver. The bile squirts out of the gallbladder and moves into the small intestine to help with these processes. We also have the pancreas, which is a pretty long organ and often neglected in many conversations. The pancreas has many, many different really important hormonal activities, and it also is releasing different molecules that support the digestion and breakdown of food, but also the utilization of nutrients afterwards. The food keeps moving through the small intestine, and then it moves into the large intestine, and then starts its passage of food through the large intestine before it comes out the other end. So it's actually a 9-meter long, a roundabout in most adults, this long hollow tube from start to finish. But there's actually so many different things happening. And obviously, as I said before, there can be a cascade of signaling changes that can happen when something's not going right. And that's what I want to help you guys understand a little bit more. So what are the main processes that the gastrointestinal tract is in charge of? So first of all, we've got ingestion. Then we've got propulsion, and propulsion is the movement of food through our digestive tract. And so that has to do with a movement called peristalsis, which is like these rhythmic wave-like movements that keep the food going from the start to the finish. But there's also another type of movement called segmentation, and that happens more in the small and large intestine. And it basically is like a circular movement. So the food gets turned around a lot more before the waves can keep pushing it down. It has to kind of circle around, and it increases how much absorption can take place or how much other processing can take place. Our gastrointestinal tract is also in control, or with the nervous system mainly, it's in control of secretions. So what are secretions? Mucus secretions and enzymes. It's also in charge of mechanical digestion, chemical digestion, the absorption through its epithelial cells, and then through elimination. But the GIT, one of its other main regulatory aspects is also to be a co-host our microbiome. Our gastrointestinal tract harbors a huge array of different microorganisms that can either really support our health or be really detrimental for our health. And all around these intestinal organs, it's also really densely studded with lymphatic tissue. So there is a lot of immune crosstalk going on. And the other amazing thing about the gastrointestinal epithelium, so the cells lining the interior cavity, it forms the body's largest interface with our external environment. So by external environment, it's like everything that we're ingesting, you know, through our diet and our liquid choices, but also the things that we can't see. So that could be pollutants and particles, you know, like heavy metals, and all sorts of things can move into our digestive system that we're actually not aware of. And so this epithelium provides a barrier that selectively limits the permeation of nutrients, but also luminal toxins and antigens. And it also allows the passage of some other ions and electrolytes and water. And the GIT is really exposed to an incredibly unique and constantly changing chemical and microbiota environment. And that's because all of these processes that I just said are really modified by what we are ingesting. And so that's, as I said before, it's like the dietary things, but the things that we don't know, plus all of these ingested contents and our subsequent internally generated responses dictates population shifts within the microbiota. So there's all of these different bits and pieces, these interconnectedness going on all the time. And we need our microbiota to survive. We literally cannot live without them. You know, from birth, they are helping to shape, develop, and train both our nervous and immune systems, and they contribute to the development and regulation of our intestinal physiology. And so part of their role is in the generation of really numerous bioactive substances. So short chain fatty acids, neurotransmitters, inflammatory mediators, vitamins. They're also involved in bile and lipid metabolism. So really, it's important to keep in mind that to thrive, a healthy host and microorganism balance must be respected in order to optimally perform metabolic and immune functions and prevent dis-ease development. I love that the deeper understanding of that word. Dis-ease is really that lack of harmony in a body. There is disorder, there is dis-ease, there is no harmony. And so our microbiome is a really big player in that relative level of dis-ease or harmony. Our microbiomes, and therefore our GIT function, is obviously also shaped by our genetics, our epigenetics, which means like whether genes are switched on or switched off, the whole birth process. So the paternal and maternal health status, also the maternal health status the whole time while she was carrying her baby, birth, what happens with that birth, was it vaginal, was it cesarean, you know, was there hospitalization, was there antibiotics, was there vaccinations, we've got breastfeeding, skin contact, the stress response of the mother. There's also geographic location. Hyperhygiene mentality will play a big role in decreasing microbiota diversity. So, you know, that might seem to be a bigger problem in the world at the moment just because of the COVID issues that have been presented all around the world. Hyperhygiene behaviors can be very, very disturbing for both your skin and your gut and your lungs. There's also drug use that could be pharmaceutical and or recreational. I already mentioned hospitalization and surgery, but then there's also sleep patterns, exercise, your muscle to fat ratio, your weight. There's also your nervous system regulation. So the energy, your emotional state at any given time will be dictating a lot of what's happening within your nervous system. And your nervous system is a really big controller of what is happening within your digestive system. So any other alterations in epithelial barrier function, so that could be from toxin exposure or allergens, you know, things that through the diet that your epithelial barrier doesn't really like, you know, like glyphosates or gluten, you know, dairy, other proteins. So there's a whole host of lifestyle and environmental and genetic factors that contribute to the way that you exhibit your own personal microbiome signature. And any GIT issues obviously then can be compounded effects of multiple factors. And that's what makes it, sometimes you have to be a real detective to unpack what's happening within a person, but empowering yourself with knowing more about the digestive tract does at least lead you down being able to ask better questions or provide better referrals, or to look after your own health in a better way. All right, let's move on. Okay, so all of the cleverly designed parts and processes of the digestive tract really have one goal. That's to convert all of our food into molecules that are small enough to be absorbed and then utilized. And so each part has a very important role to play, and it's got its own very particular structure and function. And you can see on this diagram that it's got its own very particular pH. The pH is really important because it regulates secretions, like what sort of cells are needed, what sort of secretions are needed, but it also regulates what the microbiome populations are going to be. Different microbiome populations prefer different pHs, and so the optimal pH that's listed here means that you're going to be getting a greater diversity and of the microbiome communities that actually support or enhance or just maintain our health. And so the amazing thing also in terms of looking at the time, obviously each organ system has a very unique time frame of contact with our food. Again, if things are working optimally, this is like an optimal time positioning that we're looking at here. The only one I don't agree with is the large intestine, 10 hours to several days. Do not agree with that it should be like 10 hours to 24 hours maximum. So several days does not really enter into the way I think about health and the way a healthy GIT tract should be moving. Okay, so the other amazing thing is just the volume of gastrointestinal secretions. So with all of these different areas and the different pHs they have and the different amount of time that they spend with the food contents that you've ingested, there's, gastric, salivary, pancreatic, and intestinal and biliary secretions that amount to up to 8 liters a day in an adult. And so each single day, our gastrointestinal tract, or I'm going to call it the GIT, can process up to 10 liters of food, liquids, and GI secretions. The other amazing thing about the large intestine is that less than 1 liter of that is entering the large intestine. So each organ is so important for what's happening with the next, and they all have such important jobs to do. The other thing that I wanted to mention here that's listed on this slide is the sphincters that are located between organs. So we've got our upper esophageal sphincter, and that's really important for keeping us alive. When we swallow food, it makes sure that the food goes down our esophagus into our stomach, not into our lungs. Our lower esophageal sphincter is where people will have issues if they have too low stomach acid or too high stomach acid. Low stomach acid is actually much more common than too high stomach acid. And that sphincter, a sphincter is also like a circular muscle that opens and closes, that it's allowing the passage of the contents of the canal to continue to move. So it's tightly regulated, it's smooth muscle control, so involuntary control, apart from in our rectum. And so, yeah, it allows for the tight regulation of the contents to keep moving through. So the lower esophageal sphincter, if that's not working properly, people would have heartburn, reflux, GERD, there's a few other things that can happen if that sphincter isn't working properly. The pyloric sphincter is what's allowing the passage of food to move from the stomach into the small intestine. We've got the ileocecal sphincter, which is where our small intestine is releasing chyme or the liquid into the large intestine. And then we've got our anal sphincter. So right before the last end hurrah happens, that sphincter needs to come into control. And every single part of the digestive system that we're looking at now has really different peristaltic timing. So these rhythmic involuntary muscle contractions that keep the food moving at the different time rates that you can see on this picture. So we've got these longitudinal muscles that are involved in those wave-like contractions, but we've also got another type of movement called segmentation that happens in the small intestine and also in the large intestine, and it's circular muscles that basically churn the food around to maximize absorption capabilities and contact time, and to make sure that the passage of food as it moves through is slow enough for the organ to do its functions properly. And so unlike peristalsis, segmentation can really slow the process. So peristalsis can keep things moving quite fast, whereas segmentation will really slow things down. And another interesting thing to note here, that scientific studies have hypothesized that any epithelial mucosal damage and inflammation can affect our involuntary contractile gut motility because it's interfering with the complex hormone and nerve and immune modulatory regulation of the intestinal mucosa. And I'll briefly talk about about that a little bit later. But first, I'd like to introduce you to gut hormones. You might not have heard this before. The gut is the largest endocrine organ in your body. So there's over 30 different hormones that are secreted. And gut hormones have many key roles in the control of metabolism. They target really diverse tissues. They're obviously intimately involved in the control of intestinal function. So gastric emptying, gut motility, so the time that it is in each organ, and then the movement of food through it, secretions, nutrient assimilation, and the utilization of food intake. The other thing to remember about hormones is that they are interacting with their own specific receptors at different points in the gut-brain axis, and I'll talk about that later. And so this can also affect our short-term or long-term or intermediate feelings of hunger and satiety. So whether we're feeling full or hungry and the extent of that. And so obviously things can go wrong with people as they become more insensitive to their hormones. Hormones are the hormones too. I might just explain this first. The hormones are produced by a whole lot of scattered cells. It only takes about 1% of the cell population of all the epithelial cells lining our digestive tract. They're called enteroendocrine cells, and enteroendocrine basically means entero-gut and endocrine hormone. So gut hormone cells, they possess these really unique surface receptors that allow them to respond to the huge and very complex and very daily changing variety of nutrients, the tastes, what's happening mechanically and physiochemically, like the stimuli that's occurring. As well, they're responding to the internal secretions, your microbiome, and also toxic compounds. The interesting thing about these enteroendocrine cells is that the sensing is complex, and science still doesn't really understand it. But basically, to encapsulate it, gut hormones have the ability to generate signals related to the rate of our nutrient absorption, the composition of what's in our lumen, like what's in our GIT tract, and the integrity of our epithelial barrier. And they encode this information using different transmitters, and then they send those signals to the body through the secretion of hormones or release of neurotransmitters. So that's how the nervous system and these enteroendocrine cells lining your epithelium, they're working together in constant communication the whole time. And it's important to note here that products of food digestion, and what I mean by that is things like glucose or sugars, amino acids or proteins, fatty acids, and microbial fermentation products like short chain fatty acids. They also stimulate these enteroendocrine cell responses. And when a hormone is produced, we obviously need nutrients for that, but the receptors also need their own nutrients. So if there is a range of nutrient deficiency or excess, that will interfere with the way the hormone signaling or the receptor, the release of the hormone or the reception of the hormone is going to be working. And we have to have them working properly because they all must work together to achieve these, the four main actions that are required for a proper functioning GIT tract, like the motility, the secretion, the digestion, and the absorption. And studies are showing that the secretion of several hormones that regulate GIT motility can be altered as a consequence of intestinal mucosal damage and inflammation. And so you might know this term like intestinal hyperpermeability, like leaky gut. That is going to promote immune activation and changes in our hormones. And just to give you a little bit more relevance on this, you may have heard of metabolic syndrome before. It affects about 1/3 of all Aussie adults, but it can also obviously affect children and adolescents. And they have developed an insensitivity to hormones such as leptin, adiponectin, and insulin, amongst others. And this metabolic syndrome is an umbrella term that encompasses many conditions like obesity, dyslipidemia, which means issues with your triglycerides and your cholesterols, hypertension, so high blood pressure. High blood pressure puts a lot of, it changes a lot of what's happening in your capillaries and your arteries and your venules, and can create stiffness, and other sorts of inflammatory conditions like atherosclerosis can occur because of that. And also insulin resistance. Insulin resistance underlies type 2 diabetes mellitus, and over 1 million Aussies have type 2 diabetes, which is a completely lifestyle and dietary oriented condition. So the components of metabolic syndrome is scary because they have really wide-ranging effects, many of which impact the central nervous system and can result in many neurodegenerative diseases and disorders. And it is linked to dysfunction and degeneration of our blood-brain barrier. So when you've got a leaky gut going on, which is metabolic syndrome, because of all those things that it encompasses, we'll have a leaky gut going on. You've also got a leaky brain going on. And so things that influence that are, high-fat diet, high-sugar diet, microbiome changes, inactive lifestyles, and genetic predispositions. And so all of those factors are related to your digestive system. Anyway, let us move on. All right. So the regulation of the control, so whether it's our hormone control or the muscle control or the nerve control, can be dysregulated by inflammation, which I have on this little slide. But what I wanted to talk about is that the rhythm of control is actually set by these little internal pacemakers. And I'm not going to go into great depth about this, but they're called the interstitial cells of Kajal, or ICCs. And this functional clock pacemaker really governs the diurnal or daily rhythms of many different physiological functions. So things like cell proliferation, motility, digestion, and transport processes. The cell proliferation is particularly important because, we're shedding our gut lining. Every 4 to 7 days, there is a movement of cells are shedding out. And so the diurnal rhythms can really impact that quite greatly. So our diurnal rhythms, or circadian rhythms, are related to the 24-hour period that matches the Earth, the day and the night cycle. And it regulates our behavior day to day, but it also regulates the behavior of our organs, our tissues, and our cells. So we can have cells with their own individual clocks. We can have tissues with their own clocks going on that are different to another tissue or organ system, and different organs have their own clocks going on because they've aligned to what your normal diurnal patterns are. So disruptions of these can be really detrimental, and it can result in things like metabolic syndrome, which I just spoke about, and many other diseases or disorders in the body. The other thing about our intestinal microbiome is that it also has its own circadian rhythm. So our microbiome needs to be working in harmony with us for optimal health and wellness. So to optimize our gastrointestinal function and our overall health, our circadian rhythms play a really big role. Okay, next slide. So when it comes to looking more closely at the GIT tract, it's organized into really distinct cellular layers. And each of these cellular layers has really distinct, unique properties that are really integral to the physiological activity of the system as a whole, but also for each organ system. So the layers include the mucosa. So I'll just move my little cursor to the mucosa. So it faces the lumen. So the lumen is the space. So inside the lumen, that's where our food contents are. And so facing the lumen, we've got mucosa, which contains a very thin, delicate epithelial layer. Then it's got this lamina propria, which is the next layer in, and then it's got the muscularis mucosae. So that is the entire mucosa layer. These three components primarily provide protection from the luminal matter, and they offer the first line and barrier of support and communication. And it is the first layer that nutrients must pass through to be able to reach the bloodstream. So how intact this layer is really, really important, because it's not just nutrients that can reach the bloodstream, it's other metabolites and toxins that aren't meant to be there that can be leaking through. The epithelium is composed of a single layer of intestinal epithelial cells. So it's really thin, really delicate, as I said. These single cells are held together by tight junctions. And if you're not too sure of tight junctions, they are really special cell-to-cell adhesion junctions between neighboring epithelial and endothelial cells. And so they help act as a physical barrier. So they're monitoring, preventing, and or allowing the passage of ions and molecules through the space between two interacting cells. We also have tight junctions in our skin and many other places in our body. Tight junctions are really, really important. And a lot of the regulation of this layer of the mucosa is going to involve some really specific nutrients. And the ones that I talk about the most are vitamin A, vitamin D, zinc, omega-3s, and choline. So any deficiencies in one or all of them are going to result in an increased risk to inflammation and disordered function of the mucosa. The lamina propria, which is the next layer in, is basically loose collagenous connective tissue, and it actually is kind of similar to our dermal layer. So there's fibroblasts, lymphocytes, plasma cells, macrophages, mast cells. It also contains mucosal glands throughout the entire length of your gastrointestinal tract, although in the stomach, these glands extend through the entire width of lamina propria. Like our stomach requires a lot more mucus to help protect us from the acid that's formed in there. It also contains a lot of blood capillaries and lymphatic vessels and lymphatic follicles. And I just want to remind you that the lymphatic vasculature throughout our whole body plays crucial roles in tissue fluid homeostasis, also immune surveillance, and the transport of dietary fats from our intestine to the bloodstream. So in the small intestine only, lipid-soluble molecules move into the lymphatic vessels, and here they're called lacteals. And so lipid transport by lacteals is also tightly regulated process, and tight junctions have a crucial role with that there also. And impairment of this regulation can lead to systemic metabolic consequences. And I do, again, discuss this sort of thing in my longer seminars, but it's good to bring up here. So, you know, if you've got issues with tight junctions through your mucosa, you also will have issues happening within the delivery and the processes that are happening within the lacteals. So your lymphatic system's under pressure, your dietary lipids and the resources behind that are under pressure. The submucosa. So the submucosa is relatively thicker. It's really highly vascular. So it moves from capillaries into bigger blood networks. And so other absorbed elements and nutrients that pass through the mucosa are picked up by the submucosa blood vessels. And from there, they're going to be taken into the hepatic circulation called the portal vein circulation and taken to the liver for processing. Sorry, my computer just did a little flicker. And so I want to say something else about the liver. So if you have leaky gut going on, so if you have leaks going through this mucosa section through into your submucosa, the things that move into your bloodstream are things that your liver doesn't really want to be dealing with. So it can be actually bacterial byproducts and metabolites. It can be toxins and other substances can literally flow through to your liver, and your liver is already doing over 500 different regulatory jobs for your whole body. It's such a sentinel for our entire body system. It's an incredible organ. Yet if we've got a leaky gut going on, there is so much extra stress that we're placing the liver under in terms of it having to deal with that. And that's why gut dysfunction can lead to liver dysfunction really, really quickly. Now, just going back to the submucosa, what I hadn't spoken about here is the submucosal plexus. The plexus of Meissner is called. These are collections, networks of nerves. They're found in the small and large intestine, but not the stomach and the esophagus. And why do you think that would be? Why do you think that the arrangement of nerves in the small and large intestine is so important? And it's because so much of our food digestion is taking place, and it's got to receive data from the mechanoreceptors and the chemoreceptors. And from that data, it's manipulating the secretions of hormones and the mucus, as well as blood flow. And all of these functions are heavily influenced by our parasympathetic nervous system. And I'm not unpacking that too much today, but there is a lot of different control that can happen from our rest, digest, and healing mode, our parasympathetic nervous system, and then our sympathetic nervous system, our stress response, our hormone stress response when we're in fight or flight mode. Now let's just move on to the muscularis. So down here you can see that it's got a circular muscle and a longitudinal muscle layer, but lying in between these two muscle layers, the circular and the longitudinal, we've got something called the myenteric plexus that's sandwiched between those two layers. And that's principally responsible for our peristaltic movement. And so when you combine the myenteric plexus with the plexus of Meissner, you've got our enteric nervous system, or ENS, which I'll discuss in the next slide. The last outer layer of this is called the serosa, and this layer is formed by epithelial layer and connective tissue, and basically offers support, and it's like a barrier or a partition between the internal organs and the abdominal cavity. The abdominal cavity is called the peritoneum. Cells of the serous layer secrete a serous fluid that provides a lubrication to reduce friction, so that when we're moving around or dancing or eating or bending over or whatever we're doing, our internal organs can move next to each other without creating pain or friction. So the serosa is really important for our comfort. And so I want to unpack a little bit more about this enteric nervous system. It's just written here in the middle. So we've got our central nervous system, our autonomic nervous system. It divides off into our two different branches of parasympathetic and sympathetic. So our rest and digest mode, or our fight or flight mode, and then our enteric nervous system. And I classify this, like the enteric nervous system and what's happening in the gut, as being our sixth sense organ. So like our eyes, our ears, our taste, and I call it also our second brain. And that's because sensing in the gut is conveyed by the enteric nervous system, these nerves that I just spoke about that are found within your submucosa and muscularis. And the signaling that happens there that communicates with the enteric nervous system has to interpret and cope with a really active, changing, and complex environment, a lot like our brain has to. And so the gut has as many neurons as your spinal cord, up to around 600 million neurons in an adult, that reaching from our esophagus to our anus. So there is so much internal communication happening because there's just so much information to interpret and act upon in our digestive system. And so just like we've got to act on and interpret this outside world, our gut is doing that the whole time internally. And that's why there's also this intermarriage of our emotional state and the talking then that's happening with our digestive system. And although the enteric nervous system can work independently, peripheral sensing mechanisms that regulate all the major enteric processes or gut processes, including the intestinal barrier, the epithelial secretions, the hormones, the inflammation, detecting nutrients, motility, the microvascular circulation, lymphatic circulation, and immune response, they can be relayed from the gut up through the central nervous system into the brain. These electrical signals are interpreted and acted upon by your brain in less than the blink of an eye. But also, as I said before, the emotions that you're feeling in here can also be sent down through our brain, through our CNS into our ENS, and have impacts upon our digestive system. And I'll show you a slide about that in a second. So the ENS, this enteric nervous system, so these two submucosal and myenteric plexuses, these nerve networks, they form interlinked, very so closely interlinked associations with immunoregulatory cells that lie within the gut mucosa. And that you might know this lymphatic tissue, you might have heard the words MALT, mucosal associated lymphatic tissue, or GALT, gut associated lymphatic tissue, before. Our microbiome literally plays just as important a role in these immunoregulatory activities as our lymphatic tissue does. There's constant interactions and communication and training that happens between our nervous, immune, and microbiome systems that enable our gut to respond the way that it does to the dietary products, the pathogens, the toxins, and the diverse microbiome that enters or that it's already harboring. So all of this extensive communication is the gut-brain axis. So what is the gut-brain axis? And there should just be arrows pointing every which way, really. So this is probably a little bit too linear. But basically, our gut epithelium, our microbiome, our nervous and immune system, and our nervous system, particularly, you can see we've got our enteric nervous system here that's listed. Our vagal nerve is part of our parasympathetic nervous system, or our rest digest mode. I haven't spoken much about that today. It's one of my favorite nerves to talk about, particularly related to gut function and stress response. And will have a lot to do with what happens with his HPA axis, his hypothalamic pituitary axis. That is basically related to our fight or flight response, our stress response. Our central nervous system. So you can see there's just this constant interplay of communication happening between the signaling that's happening between these environments, between one of these systems, the talking to our brain, and then our brain can interpret things that are happening out here and also let that know, or inside our own head, whether we're, dwelling on the past or future pacing, if we're stressing out in our head, we're also sending lots of signals down into our gut. So it's a bi-directional communication link. And any perturbations in this gut-brain axis accounts for the development of so many different disorders, diseases in our body. Gut-brain axis is, I don't know, probably one of the more popular topics in the scientific fields at the moment, and for very good reason. Now, let's just change tack a little bit here. I just want to talk about the different stages of digestion. So we have got 3 different stages. The cephalic stage, some people know it as the anticipatory phase, basically primes our body for metabolizing all of these ingested nutrients efficiently. And thus, it makes it a very important and often very overlooked part of digestion. About 20% of our secretions actually come from this phase. 20% is a pretty significant number. And if you think about our mouth, as I said earlier, as being the first entry point for whatever's going into our system, I think that what happens here obviously can dictate a lot of what happens through the rest of our digestive system. The cephalic stage also, it's like an innate response. It's something that happens naturally, but it also can be consciously trained in us. And part of that conscious entrainment are the sensory signals that prepare us. And so that's like the experience of food, like the smell, the touch, the sight, the thought of it, the taste of it. The taste of it keeps the cephalic phase going. As soon as we're swallowing our food, we move into the gastric phase. And about 60% of our secretions actually occur here. And so it's basically the period in which the swallowed food activates secretions by stretching the stomach. And as soon as the food contents hit the stomach, they change the pH of the stomach. So it raises the pH. And so that sends a signal saying the pH is too high, lower it down. And some cells called the parietal cells are kicked into gear, and they produce something called hydrochloric acid. And that is really important for begin or like furthering the digestion of food. Some of that has already occurred in the mouth through mechanical breakdown and salivary amylase and a couple of other things that happen in the mouth. But it's really important for the pH of the stomach to be able to break down proteins. And so as the food starts to digest and the pH starts to lower again, a negative feedback loop kicks into gear to message all the relevant hormones to say, it's okay, we're at the right pH again now, and there's no more food coming in, we're good. And so the food can stay in the stomach for kind of a few hours, and then it's going to get released into the intestinal phase. And so that occurs, the intestinal phase and the secretions that are related to it occurs as soon as the stomach releases what's called chyme at this point. So the stomach has churned down all the food, it creates this little liquid called chyme. It's going to release through this pyloric sphincter into the small intestine, and as soon as it hits the small intestine, the duodenum, that section of the small intestine, is called nervous system and the immune system and the hormonal system kick into gear to release different substances and compounds. So you get to stimulate the pancreas, you get to stimulate the gallbladder, and then you also start suppressing other gastric secretions further up. And you also are assisting with the motility signaling to allow the processing of the chyme throughout the small intestine, and then as it moves down into the large intestine. And I just briefly touched on this, but when it comes to the cephalic phase, saliva, again, a very underlooked part of our digestive process, it's really VIP. I talk about saliva a lot more in my longer presentations. Obviously, it interacts with food components, so you're forming these new complexes, microstructures, and it also modulates our oral microbiome. And we've got over 700 different species of bacteria living in our mouth, so equivalent to about the large intestine, actually. And so, like, that is really important for not just our oral health, protecting our oral cavity and protecting our gum, but also for our systemic health. And so they've done lots of different studies. They know that if there is dis-ease or disorder in our oral cavity, there's obviously going to be issues locally, but systemically through our body, it's linked to many other diseases now. They're really, the microbiota in our mouth playing a really pivotal role in the regulation of metabolic, endocrine, and immune functions. Also, when you think about the cephalic stage of digestion and stress, a lot of people just don't even notice that they're eating on the run. They've got to walk out the door in the morning, or they're looking after their kids, or they're talking to someone and they're picking up food and they're putting it in their mouth, and often they're chewing fast, if they're chewing at all. They're kind of swallowing faster than they're chewing. So some of this mechanical breakdown of food hasn't really taken place as well as it should. So our stomach is put under a little bit more pressure at that point. And that obviously is another indicator of nervous system dysregulation. Like, we're in fight or flight mode. Our emotional state is going to dictate a lot of what's happening through the optimal functioning of our gastrointestinal tract. I also wanted to mention that dehydration, electrolyte imbalance, and protein malnutrition can affect saliva production. And it's important also just for the enjoyment of food. I mean, sometimes people don't realize that they're not enjoying their food as much anymore just because they don't have a great saliva production, and because it's so important for food perception and oral sensations. I've also written down on this side for tissue regeneration. That's because there is some growth factors that are in our saliva that actually help the healing of any little repairs that might need to take throughout our epithelial lining further down the system. And that's pretty amazing. Not many people really think about that aspect either. When we have swallowed the food at that point, after we've chewed it and once we've swallowed, it's called a bolus. It hits our stomach, and we've got 3 really strong layers of muscles that mix the food and liquid with the digestive juices in the stomach. And these digestive juices, the gastric fluid contains things like vitamin C, hydrochloric acid, pepsinogen, intrinsic factor, bicarbonate, and mucus. So there's a fair bit of things going on there once you mix the food in there too. But the pH, as I said before, it's vital for the breakdown of food, especially proteins. But it's also really vital for preventing bacterial overgrowth. And then the pH of what is released into the small intestine helps to signal the next array, or the next cascade of things that need to happen in the small intestine. So that pH of the stomach content as it drops through into the small intestine is really important for the next stage of digestion. The other thing that can be a little bit hard to navigate in people is that hydrochloric acid, which is produced in the stomach, a happy stomach, is required to facilitate the extraction and absorption of vitamin B12, iron, calcium, zinc, and other trace minerals. Yet when you have a deficiency of them, you also have, it's really challenging to make hydrochloric acid if you're low in B group vitamins and zinc. And then if you don't have the right hydrochloric acid, you can't even get those vitamins. So low hydrochloric acid is an issue that's really, really common throughout Australia and I believe around the world. When our stomach contents are moving into our small intestine, as I said, it's called chyme. We've got the pyloric sphincter. So this is the stomach here. We've got the contents of the stomach that have been churned. It's turned into a little liquid called chyme. Our pyloric sphincter opens really slowly. It's really regulated to allow little drops of chyme to move into the small intestine, this duodenum, the first part of the small intestine, the duodenum just here. And then it moves into the duodenum and then the ileum. And the absorptive surface area of the small intestine is actually about 250 square meters. So it's the size of a tennis court. That's more than 100 times the surface area of your skin. And so most of the digestion is occurring here because of this incredible surface area, practically all absorption. So it's about 90% of all our nutrients and our water. And it's called the small intestine. So even though it's the longest part of our digestive tract, it's about 3 meters long. If you were to stretch it out, it's a relatively smaller diameter. It's only about 2.5 to 3 centimeters compared with the, say, 7 or 8 centimeters of the large intestine. And that's because we need to squish the food down into a really small circular space. At the same time, this circular muscle control called segmentation is churning the food around so that it can hit these little folds called villi, and it increases the contact time, so the digestion ability of the food is greatly enhanced. And so we've got these little villi that line the epithelial, that are the epithelial lining of your small intestine. On top of these villi, you've got little microvilli, so tiny little brush-like projections. You might have heard these called the brush border before. So these are tiny, like these are 0.5 to 1 millimeter long villi, and then you've got these little microvilli on top. And so the digestion of proteins and carbohydrates, some of which has occurred in the mouth and the stomach, is completed with the aid of intestinal and pancreatic juices, but also the enzymes that are released at this brush border. Lipids arrive in the in the small intestine pretty much undigested. So most of the focus in the small intestine is on lipid digestion. And it doesn't really show it in the picture here, but at the duodenum, you've got your gallbladder. There's a gallbladder tract that comes here, and then there's a pancreatic duct. And so you have bile, which is released into the small intestine that breaks down and absorbs fats, cholesterols, and some vitamins, so your fat-soluble vitamins. Bile consists of bile salts, cholesterols, bilirubin, electrolytes, and water, a couple of other things. And it's really needed, obviously, for fat emulsification and for the fat-soluble vitamins. But in turn, it's another one of these situations where you have to have fat-soluble vitamins regulating their own absorption through regulating hepatic bile acid synthesis. So if you're missing one of those components, it makes it harder to give it the component that it needs. So it can be a little bit of a vicious cycle. And that's why sometimes working with a professional to understand what your level of supplementation might be required to get you to optimal states of digestion. In a healthy person, the liver releases about 600 mils of bile into the duodenum each day. And this is done in obviously small little amounts. It just depends how much food we're eating, how much fat has come in, and how often we're eating. Now the pancreas, again, it's not in this picture, but it's sitting just behind the stomach. It's tucked in to this little section. It's about 20 centimeters long. It's a really important organ in the endocrine and digestive system because it plays a role in both the regulation of blood glucose levels and of digestion. We actually produce around 1 to 2 liters of pancreatic juice a day. So it's a lot of activity that the pancreas has to regulate. And another one of its key roles is to neutralize the pH acidity of the chyme that's coming from the stomach. So as the stomach releases the chyme through the pyloric sphincter, moves into the duodenum, it's really highly acidic. The pancreas needs to release these neutralizing agents, bicarbs and things like that, to help increase the pH again to optimize what happens in the small intestine. This also, like the increase of the pH, helps prevent autodigestion and ulceration of the epithelial lining. Like, it's really important. Those small intestine cells do not want to be eroded away by a really high pH. The stomach is a completely different structure and function to what the small intestine does. And so there needs to be changes to the pH of the content as the food's moving through. The enzymes that the pancreas produces and releases are lipase, which digests fats, amylase, which digests carbohydrates, and chymotrypsin and trypsin for digesting proteins. And I just want to mention here that zinc is the most important nutrient modulator of pancreatic function. And I did mention before that zinc is also a really important regulatory nutrient of our epithelial lining. So, you know, again, zinc comes in to play a role. And just to remind you, the mucosal epithelium, which is mainly composed of absorptive cells, covers the villi. And the intestine is also where most of the water is absorbed. And it's also where most of the lymphatic, there's a high amount of lymphatic vasculature in this area. What else did I want to say here? So the breakdown products of carbohydrates and proteins, like the sugars and the amino acids, they can enter the bloodstream directly, but the lipid breakdown products are absorbed by the lacteals, and then they're transported to the bloodstream via the lymphatic system. So nutrient-rich blood from the small intestine is then carried to the liver via the hepatic portal vein, and any other particles can also enter the blood if we do have a leaky gut situation going on. So that can obviously have pathogenic effects on the liver, because the gut and the liver are anatomically and physiologically connected. And you might have heard the term the gut-liver axis. And that gut-liver axis exerts really strong influences on what's happening within the liver and any liver pathology. Okay. And as we move on, so we've got down here, so the cecum is a little pouch that receives the chyme. So there's a little sphincter that again opens up, the little ileocecal sphincter that opens up that releases the chyme from the small intestine into the large intestine. And you can see here that there's a little appendix that's attached to the cecum, and a lot of people have found, you know, it used to be that everyone was like, the appendix does nothing, but the latest scientific research actually says it has a lot to do with our immune surveillance and regulation, and it acts as a reservoir of our really good commensal bacteria. So if we need to release any, it can store whatever it's got harbored there, you know. So whether you've got a little parasite infection or you've got diarrhea, you know, you lose a lot of your epithelial lining, you know, something irritating's happened through your digestive tract and your microbiome populations have changed. If the appendix is there, it can release a big flash of commensal bacteria to re-inoculate you. So it actually has some really important immune roles. So from the cecum, the chyme continues to loop upwards and across the colon, and it travels, you can sort of see it here, but I mean, this is meant to kind of, what's the word, stimulate like circular kind of pouches. These little circular pouches are called haustra, and you know, like the contractions that move through here is mainly segmentation, and to make the fluid, the contents move through these little pouches, and it can move through quite slowly before it descends through the descending colon into the anal cavity. So the wall of the large intestine has far more intestinal glands, and there's so many more goblet cells, and the goblet cells are secreting mucus because that's what's helping to ease the movement of the feces, and it also protects the intestine from the effects of the acids and gases that are produced by the enteric bacteria that you find here. The enterocytes absorb water and salts, as well as vitamins produced by our intestinal bacteria. So I've got it up here, B12 and K particularly. The role of commensal bacteria is to break down remaining fiber and polysaccharides and convert them into these neuroactive short-chain fatty acids. That's what the SCFA stands for here, short-chain fatty acids. You might have heard of acetate or propionate or butyrate. Butyrate particularly is pretty well known. As well, the commensal bacteria are involved in metabolizing bile salts, estrogens, androgens, lipids, and other factors. And of course, they also compose a little bit of gas. So that's a mixture of carbon dioxide, nitrogen, methane, hydrogen sulfide, and hydrogen. And that's caused by the fermentation of the polysaccharides. The more fermentation that happens here, maybe the more gas people have. Sometimes the slower passage that happens through here, maybe the more gas people have. There's lots of different reasons for excess gas, but you know, excessive gas and particularly smelly gas indicates that there's something going on in here that might need a little bit of help. Insoluble fiber is really important here, as this draws water back into the intestinal contents, and that increases its volume and it increases its weight, and that stimulates the continued muscle contractions. So if someone's not eating enough fiber, obviously it can slow things down and really compact the poo, make it much harder. The soluble fiber, as it starts being broken down by the bacteria, is actually quite gelatinous, and that helps also provide a little bit of extra lubrication and easier passage. Feces or stool or poo, whatever you want to call it, are composed of indigestible food items. They're composed of bacteria, inorganic salts, unabsorbed substances, epithelial cells, and leftover secretions, in addition to enough sufficient water for it to pass out of the body. The large intestine throughout this whole section, it also hosts a lot of lymphoid tissues, which is really vital for our continued immunity. And they assist with the creation of antibodies that act against the harmful bacteria, so it prevents infections, basically. Now, as the feces continues to move down the descending colon, into the sigmoid colon, through and into the rectum, it stimulates the defecation reflex. This is still part of our autonomic nervous system, so that's involuntary, but it can be overridden by conscious control. So we do get a little signal, and we can override that need, that defecation reflex, through conscious control. And sometimes people can actually overdo this conscious control. And when it is time to release, deep breathing and squatting really do facilitate excellent defecation due to the increase in abdominal pressure and also to the good angles that squatting creates. It really does make a very big difference. All right. So when it comes to poop, so poop is definitely more than just a punchline, I love to say. It literally is an indicator of how well the body systems are working to absorb the nutrients that you're eating. How well is it working to absorb and eliminate wastes? And how is it going, keeping everything moving? How regular is it? How regularly are those processes working for you? Bowel movements give us a really incredible insight into what's going on, not just in our body though, but also our mind. When I'm doing consults with people, it acts like a bit of a report card, and if there are issues, you do need to look at things like liver function, dehydration, lack of fiber, and other food excesses or deficiencies, gut infection, food intolerances. There's a whole host of things that you need to have a look at. Yet mind-body connection for me here is really important. I do think that how you're going to the toilet can be really a reflection on how you digest and eliminate, well, not eliminate life, but how are you digesting life? Are you holding on? Are you controlling? Are you fearful? In which case you generally see a lot more constipation. Are you just super busy all the time? You're running from one thing to another. You don't have enough time to process life or emotions. You feel a little bit out of control. Well, your stool motions are going to be a little bit looser, a little bit waterier. I find that with people who are alternating between the two, it can suggest underlying insecurities. So it's like they've got one foot in each camp. It's like they want to be liked and they want to fit in, but they never really know or trust in themselves and where they stand. It's like they're trying to decide who they are and who they are being and who they want to be. So, you know, like they're switching between different emotional states. And there's so many different varieties of reasons why a stool can change color, but the color can definitely indicate things that are going on. So whether it's floating or yellow or chalky or pale or greasy, if it sticks to the toilet bowl, if it's really foul smelling, if there's blood or if there's mucus, any and all of these can be a red flag. And it's really important that you take more notice of your poo and what's happening with your poo. It really is your report card. And a lot of people miss this really clear signal of how your internal system, your gastrointestinal system, nervous system, immune system, hormonal system, nervous system is functioning because they're not taking the time to stop and look. And it's certainly not common discussion at most dinner tables, yet if people were having a little bit more awareness of this last stage of digestion and elimination, they would have a lot more awareness of what was happening in their body. So I have written down on the right like the following situations that may suggest an issue. They're definitely things to follow up on both within yourself or if you were looking after another person. I think that they're really important questions to ask. And on my intake form, I definitely have quite a few questions around this, and I will delve into it more with my naturopathic consultations. And so that comes to the end of the presentation. And so, I mean, I know we delved into a lot, and I just wanted to know what is different for you now that you have this understanding, and has it made you want to know more about other things? I definitely would appreciate your feedback and your comments, and I'm always open to suggestions for further topics. Obviously, I love educating, and I offer this in a number of different formats. But if you'd like to connect with me, you can find me on a couple of different Facebook pages and a Facebook group, and also my website. So yeah, please connect with me. I'd love to have you as part of my tribe. And I look forward to connecting with you another day soon. Thank you so much.